And I wanted to ask you a question. So,
Yes.
Matthew 24 is obviously, if my understanding is correct, Matthew 24 is the main reason, if my understanding is correct, the main reason why liberal scholars, let's say, have a late dating of the gospel, right? Exactly for this preterist view, let's say.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but the point is like,
usually the gospels are dated, folks, after 65, 70 AD, because they don't believe that there could have been a prophecy about Jerusalem temple being destroyed 40 years earlier. So they say the fact that Matthew and Luke and Mark mentioned this prophecy means that they're writing close enough that they're seeing Jerusalem's in trouble or after it was destroyed. That's why they date it late. That's the primary reason, believe it or not.
The point of the question was like, once I heard, and I wanted to know your opinion about it, that it can be, even if you're a liberal scholar, there are reasons to believe it's not kind of written after, because, for example, it says, pray that it doesn't happen in the winter, but if my understanding is correct, we're actually starting in the summer.
And also pray that it doesn't take place on the Sabbath. So that proves to you he's talking to a Jewish audience.
Exactly, yeah. Actually, yeah.
You get it? In Matthew, he says, pray that your flight doesn't have winter or the Sabbath, right?
Right, yeah.
So what does that tell you? If he's saying Sabbath, then that means he's talking about Jews and Jerusalem. Because in the Sabbath, they're forbidden. Yeah. They're forbidden from walking a certain amount of miles.
It seems to me, obviously I'm not a scholar, but like from the context of the chapter, also saying, be ready because I come like a thief. Like there is no way that they wrote it after, So I mean, the question is like, kind of that. Do we have any reason to question, even if you are a liberal? Like, do you have any reason to believe real reason other than kind of presuppositionalism against prophecies that it was written was written before the destruction of the temple? Because it seems to me from the internal evidence, it seems to me it doesn't really
hold. It's the church fathers, basically, because when Irenaeus comments on Revelation, remember Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp is an eyewitness of John. He says that John wrote the Revelation during the reign of Domitian. That's 90-95 AD. So if you don't really care what Irenaeus says, then you can then date Revelation before 70 AD.
No, I was saying Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew.
Oh, Mark. No, I'm sorry. I thought you said Revelation. I'm sorry. No, Matthew 24, the evidence is it's before 70 AD. Let me give you now a strong case. Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts are written before 70 AD. And the only reason why you would place them later is because you're stubborn and don't want to affirm the historical accuracy of the Bible and that there's a God who can tell you the future before it happens. Luke ends his discussion in Acts 28 with Paul at Rome under house arrest, though he's got freedom to have guests coming to him, waiting his trial before Caesar, right?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the entire climax of Acts is Paul going before Caesar, but we're not told what happened. He ends it with him still under house arrest. So, number one, if Luke was writing after Paul's encounter with Caesar, we'd expect then he'd mention Paul went before Caesar, because he mentions Paul talking to Felix and Festus and preaching to them. Well, the most powerful person at the time is the emperor. The last thing Luke would admit is what Paul said to the emperor Caesar about Jesus, right?
Yeah, I remember you once
mentioned. But he leaves us hanging. And he doesn't even tell us, then was he set free? We don't even know. Did he go to Caesar? Was he killed or was he set free? Secondly, Luke's main characters in the book are Peter and Paul. First 9 chapters is about Peter. Then the rest is about Paul. Okay, these two are the main characters of the book. He also mentions James as the leader of Jerusalem, Acts 15. Okay. Now, Luke mentions Stephen being the first martyr. He also mentions James, the brother of John, being killed by Herod, Acts 12, 1-2. But now, the main characters of the book, Peter and Paul, not a single word about them being killed or about them dying. If he's writing after 70 AD, we know from church history, Peter and Paul were killed in the 60s. And yet Luke doesn't mention their deaths the main characters of his book. But he mentions the death of Stephen and James, the brother of John, but he wouldn't mention how Peter and Paul died if he's writing after the fact. Thirdly, we're told by Eusebius, who's quoting Hegesippus, that James, the Lord's brother, mentioned by Josephus, by the way, which is ironic. Josephus, writing in the 90s, mentions that James, the Lord's brother, was thrown off the pinnacle of the temple. When he landed, he was stoned and clubbed to death. If Luke was writing after James was killed, then we would expect him to mention James' death. And due to the chronology, people date James' death to around 62 AD. And if you read Hegesippus, he's quoted in Eusebius, or even Josephus, James was killed because he talked about the Son of Man coming down to destroy the place. And so he's thrown off the pinnacle, clubbed and stoned, and he died. 62 AD. If Luke is written after 70 AD, then why doesn't he mention the death of James and why he was killed? Because he's also an important character. So 3 important characters, he doesn't mention their deaths. Okay. Moreover, since Luke records that Jesus prophesied destruction of the temple, what better thing to do than to mention its fulfillment? Right? Look, Jesus announced it, fulfilled. He doesn't mention that. Do you know why?
Because it didn't happen yet. That's basically
exactly. That means Luke must have been written before 62 AD, before James was martyred, before Peter was martyred, before Paul was martyred, before the temple was destroyed. Okay, now if Luke is written before 62 AD, and that's Acts, that means the gospel is written before Acts. So now you push Luke and Acts at the beginning of 60, maybe even the 50s. But then Matthew and Mark are written before Luke and Acts. So now you just pushed Matthew and Mark in the 50s, if not even the 40s.
And also,
now let me give you an evidence that Mark was written probably even the 40s. Go to Mark 14, 60 to 64. Mark says the high priest condemned Jesus, but he doesn't tell you the name of the high priest.
Yes, and that's another one, right? Because I
you,
remember you
right?
said this.
How do we know it's Caiaphas? Because he doesn't tell you it's Caiaphas, right?
Yes, it doesn't tell us because John tells us, right?
And Matthew and Luke. That means Matthew and Luke, they're written early, but late enough they have to tell you who the high priest was. Mark is written even earlier, where he doesn't need to tell you because the people he's writing to know who the high priest is. Caiaphas, because Caiaphas reigned from 18 to 37 AD. In other words, here, let me give you an example. If I were to write to you and saying, the president has destroyed the economy because he's jacked up inflation. Now, you're going to know which president I'm talking about if you're in America, right?
Yeah.
Who would that be, Ed?
Biden, basically.
Okay, but what if 40 years from now, someone's writing about the economy during Biden's reign? He can't say president, right? Because there would be a new president. So he'd have to say President Biden, right?
Yeah, it would be confusing because maybe Trump might be the one after Biden, yeah.
That means Mark is written early enough where he knows his audience already know who the high priest is Caiaphas. He doesn't mention it. Matthew and Luke, though early, they must have been written a little later to an audience that may not have known it's Caiaphas, so they mention Caiaphas by name, right?
Yeah.
So now I've given you strong internal evidence. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Acts, all written before 60, in the 50s, if not the 40s.
The Gospel of John is later. I think
yes.
one is that he mentions the name of Peter and Malchus. And
yes, because if you read Matthew 26 or Mark, it says one of the disciples of Jesus cut off the ear, right, of the high priest servant. But he doesn't tell you who. John tells you is Peter. Another thing, if you read Mark 13, you're told that a woman anointed Jesus for his burial, right?
Mark 13, yes.
Mark 13, right?
Yes.
Which is also found in Matthew 26, correct?
Yes.
You know who it was?
Mary?
Mary, the sister of Lazarus, but that's because John tells us later.
That was, yeah.
Okay, you understand? When Mark, Matthew, Luke don't tell you Peter cut off the ear of the high priest servant, and we're told that the high priest servant name is Malchus, and then Mark, Matthew, Luke don't tell you that the woman that anointed Jesus for his burial is Mary, the sister of Lazarus, that means they're writing early enough where they want to keep their identity hidden so that people won't find them and persecute them.
You know, another thing, Sam, now that you mentioned this, the very fact that they don't mention Peter, but they don't also mention Malchus. And I'm thinking, if I'm Malchus, you know, this guy cut my hair, and then the Lord heals me, I'm going to become a believer. And so, is it even possible? And actually, I was reading that Malchus is an early church Christian, right?
Yeah,
because
he saw the miracle. But you
right.
get my point. This only makes sense if Matthew, Mark, Luke are written early, where there are still authorities looking to arrest, persecute, kill Peter, Mary, whoever it is, because of their ties with Christ. So the authors are keeping their identity secret. But then John is writing way later, where now he can mention the names because either Peter, Mary, Malchus, they're dead, or the authorities who would want to kill them are gone.
Exactly, yeah. Fantastic.
So this is the kind of evidence that shows you our gospels are very early.
Can I still man 1 second kind of the liberal position? Can I still man 1 second? Yeah, I said it could be that the Bible was written in sections, in pieces, right?
But you're making my case, though, right? Because that means that some of these sections are so early, they have to come from eyewitnesses.
Yeah. But the argument is like, okay, maybe the passion narrative was written very early, but Matthew 24 was written after. So that's the only good argument.
After when?
After the destruction of the temple.
So it's written after destruction, but there is no indication of its being fulfilled. In other words, they're going to write about Jesus prophesying destruction of the temple, and yet Acts, the history that centers on Jerusalem, doesn't mention the fulfillment.
Yeah, it's crazy, yeah.
So let's go with that. Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21 were written after destruction of the temple. And yet when Luke gives us a history in Acts, and the main center is Jerusalem, and doesn't mention the fulfillment, why?
Yeah,
what do you want to show how Jesus fulfilled it as proof that he's a prophet from God?
It's the only argument they have because it's
okay,
clear.
But I'm going to run with it. So according to this view, Luke wrote after 70 AD, but doesn't mention how the words of Jesus were fulfilled in order to bolster that Jesus is a prophet of God. Nor does he mention nor does he mention Peter, Paul, and James being martyred, the main characters of his book. He fails to mention all that when his aim was to deceive people thinking Jesus made an accurate prophecy and it was fulfilled, but doesn't mention all of that in a book, Acts, where one of the main themes of the book is Jerusalem as a center of Christian activity. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I know, makes sense. Unless you want to go really kind of conspiracy theory and say something like, yeah. Exactly. By the way, Sam,
if someone has to, by the way, no, I don't want to cut you off. If someone has to resort to that level, then there's no use talking because the evidence is on him to show they were different sections brought together. What manuscript evidence do you have for that argument?